We have time for our Q&A right now. Is that the first question we have? All right. So we have, we're going to have Damber and Sarah on screen. I'll invite Rhonda to come up. And I have the wandering mic here if you want to take the podium. And just set it up here. There we go. All right. We have 2 questions already. So we'll go to Michelle first.
Thank you all very much for wonderful presentations. My question has to do with feedback from the congregations. Did any of your participants, especially the ones in leadership roles, did they mention having a process for people to give their feedback about the initiatives that you're taking, especially when it came to, intercultural music or reconciliation or any of the justice initiatives that that they were a part of?
I can start. Mine, that wasn't a question I asked directly. Though indirectly, people had brought up just responses in general, conversations, nothing formal.
I'm happy to pick up on it, Michelle. It was something that came up a little bit, and there was kind of a collective frustration with governance structure and some of the churches that I spoke to, kind of around, if we have these structures, like where does the feedback come from? How is it coming up? How is it going down? Like that information dissemination was a challenge expressed there. Yeah, so it was kind of like, I spoke about the silos, kind of like if you're in the silo, if you're doing the work, like you have this avenue of communicating those challenges. But if you're outside, it is hard to break into that. So that was kind of what I picked up on.
Responding to your question, Michelle, I did ask the questions to my interviewers as to know exactly what might be the right pathway into finding the solution to the conflict that is going on in singing. And they did have nothing to share with me because there is no absolute pathway. And but I received at the same time some few suggestions that trying to invite people to participate in worship planning would be the best idea to incorporate diverse musics into the singing.
So this is a clear theme in Sarah's presentation, but I wondered if all of you could just reflect briefly on your vulnerability as a researcher.
It's going to take me a second. Danver, I don't know if you have an immediate response.
If this question is for me, then my answer would be I felt so vulnerable when I tried to reach out to my interview with the very challenging question, which is regarding their cultural background. And people feel vulnerable in the same way as I did. And there was a moment when they went very emotional.
Yeah, I'm still thinking.
Rhonda?
Still thinking.
I was just going to add that for me, some of the vulnerability that I felt was in justice to the topic. And in speaking to people, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't speaking in a way that would have people shut down because it didn't come across as authentic or genuine or using the wrong language. And there's so many different pieces. And so I felt lots of vulnerability in that as well.
Yeah, and I think coming in as a learner, right? I'm not coming in with trying not to come in with a preconceived notion of what ought to be happening was hard for me, and kind of setting that aside and making myself vulnerable in that. So not coming in as an expert, because I'm not, but you know, like somebody's coming in to interview you, you might perceive that person as having a specific interest or something related to the topic. So kind of being clear about that with my interview, saying, you know, I'm not an expert, I'm just genuinely curious. I genuinely don't know. I genuinely want to know.
Thank you. We have another question in the room. I'm going to pass the mic to Laura and offer a reminder before I do that to put your questions in the chat if you are online.
Thank you. This question is for Sarah. I don't. Maybe you covered this, but from an Indigenous perspective, what were you able to sort of hear how we could know that our efforts at reconciliation, like how to evaluate that, or if there's feedback coming from the Indigenous side of the reconciliation sort of movement of if our efforts are you know, making any difference?
That's a great question. No. Though there were 2 Indigenous people that I interviewed, I really worked to keep the questions and the focus one on a clergy person's perspective and not from an Indigenous community or as an Indigenous person. What I can say to that though is that projects that were in collaboration with people from band or a nation had good outcome, but nothing specific. There was no little checklist that said, you know, this is the recipe for great connection. But yeah, sorry, Laura, nothing more than that.
Laura wants to know, so how did she know it was a good outcome?
How did the people know it was a good outcome? I think because the relationship at the end had grown, that there was want for continued relationship, and that people were encouraged, like people within the congregation wanted to continue learning about it. I think just the continued want to participate and engage.
I'm sensing perhaps this could be a launching pad for another study that builds on Sarah's project, so that's great. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative to ask a question to Damber. I've done some research on interculturalism as well, but not about music, and one thing I really appreciated about your presentation, Damber, is how complicated it was, and that there were, you know, you interviewed, like, even if you'd interviewed 20 people, you would have had 50 different experiences of music and worship. So, but I also know that you have your own experiences of music and worship as your instructor. I walked with you on this journey, and one thing I've been dying to ask you all along the way, and I've saved for today, is what surprised you about this? Because you came with particular ideas and biases like everyone does, but what surprised you about your research and what you learned?
Thank you for this question. Now, I was mostly surprised by the diverse culture within the same congregation, and still people would continue to gather in the same space for so long time, and there had been no big issue at all, and everything was under management, under manageable radar, and nothing big incident happened there. That surprised me. And another thing I was surprised of was that how could the worship leaders manage those people that coming from very diverse backgrounds and make people move their lips, pretending that they are as if they are still singing, even though they make no noise at all.
Well, a little plug for AST. We do have a course, I believe, this summer called the Congregation Song. So maybe, Damber, you've got some required reading in that you're going to be producing, some writing that will become required reading. Other questions in person, in the chat? Yes, Ross.
Thanks to all of you. It's good to be here and hear your work. My question is probably a very narrow one, and it's for Rhonda. You repeatedly said that people referred to burnout. Mm-hmm. And burnout is a term that we hear over and over and over again, but I'm really not clear what it means, because it means so much. And so when your interviewees were saying burnout was an issue, what did you understand them to mean?
Sure. And what I understood that to mean largely was a fatigue, like a general tiredness within the congregation, an inability to move beyond what they're doing or to move forward. So kind of like a momentum ceasing moment. So a collective kind of just slump, tiredness. Yeah, that was how they expressed and experienced burnout in that sense. I know it's a broad term and it's kind of an individual definition. How I might define it differs from how you define it. But the theme generally was just kind of like a lack of interest or a tiredness or an inability to bring new people on board, that kind of thing.
Okay, if I could just push a little bit, were in any of your congregations, were there new initiatives which caught people up? Because I'm wondering whether burnout has to do with energy or inspiration, and wondering how those two might have played out. I wonder if you had any examples of that.
Yeah, so not really. The folks that I interviewed, these ministries have been established for some time. So in terms of new innovation, I can't respond to that. I don't know. Yeah.
Just building on that, I was just fascinated by, as a theological educator, we hear a lot about burnout. How do we help clergy not to burn out? But it's such an individualistic idea. I just was, my mind was kind of blown when you talked about that for some congregations it was this communal, as you said, this slump. And I love how you actually, you embodied it. That it's just this,
It's maybe how I'm feeling right now.
You should. It was great. It was great. Any other questions? Lots of accolades coming through the chat. Please add your questions too. Oh, we have a question at the back. Dr. Clark.
Great. Again, thank you so much for your presentations. I thoroughly enjoyed each of them. All three of you thematically talk about how two entities kind of engage each other. Sarah, most graphically, with First Nations or Indigenous people and kind of the Eurocentric worldview or other worldviews that come into North America. But you also have the sense of justice and how we bridge those. So the theme that I saw in all three, and Damber also, and you, how are we neighbor to each other? Right? So being neighbor means something. There's something at stake in being neighbor to each other. And I'm wondering what resistance, if you just name kind of one big resistance that you encountered in your research that prohibits us from being neighbor. If we can get at that resistance, we might be able to get at the deeper levels of what we're about. So one resistance perhaps that you might have seen in your research.
Thank you for the question. What I have found there is that being defensive of our own cultural pattern and our traditional belief, and not try to reach out to others, to learn from others. That has been the most challenging part. Why would people not acknowledge or recognize other cultural behaviors? So that has been very challenging part that I have learned from my interviewees. And as we know that we try to be on our own and follow our own tradition and cultures. And there is phobia, cultural phobia oftentimes that when we happen to expose ourselves to different culture, then there is a kind of shock. And we don't want that happen to us. So that is why we try to avoid such circumstances to happen in our life. So we become defensive. Thank you for the question.
I'm happy to speak to that, Jody, and thanks for the question. So the folks that I interviewed were engaged with this work, so their kind of defenses were not there necessarily because they are doing the work. But one thing they did express kind of, they're working within the community of their congregation, right? So one thing that did come up a few times, and I don't know really where this comes from, but people talked about the issue of safety. So for example, there is one church that has a community fridge on their site. And there was great aversion to this from a group of ladies in the church because they didn't want those people on their property, right? I suspect there's something deeper there, but I didn't have the chance to speak to those folks who were adverse. The folks I engaged with were the ones doing the work. But that kind of question around, it may be somewhat what Dan was saying, like a phobia or a question or an uncertainty or uncomfortableness with the other, having that, yeah.
And I would say similar, that the uncomfortableness with the other, this clergy mostly spoke of the challenges or of the pushback as being rooted in preconceived notions or the need for people to unlearn or be open to new learnings. So that was part of what could be a real challenge or pushback.